Namaskar and welcome to India Diplomacy, show on national television about India's foreign relations, its foreign policy, its important partnerships, as well as India's involvement in solving major global problems and providing solutions to the big issues facing humanity at large. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up a very crucial issue, which is the G20, the group of 20, and India's leadership in this important grouping. The G20 has emerged as the premier institution for global governance in the last decade or so, and it continues to be at the center of the discussions about how to manage the global economic challenges as well as increasingly even security problems. And to discuss India's role in the G20, India's upcoming leadership of the G20, I am privileged to introduce you to our guest in the studio, Dr. Swasti Rao. Dr. Swasti Rao is Associate Fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, an important think tank of India, and she specializes on Europe and Asia, and has worked in Japan, studied in Japan, and she talks about the intersection between global South and global North, which is of course the center point of the entire G20 process because it brings both global South and North. Dr. Rao, G20, India's leadership, we have done this even before holding the presidency, but now there's a bigger emphasis on India's leadership because we are taking over the presidency for the first time, and it's a momentous occasion. We will be holding it from December 2022 onwards. Yes. And a lot of hopes and aspirations around India's leadership. The IMF chief was quoted as saying that India's presidency is going to be a landmark one and will leave a mark on the future evolution of this important steering mechanism for the world economy and for international politics. So to begin with, the importance of G20 cannot be overemphasized, but India taking the lead, that is something we are very proud of, and we are working very hard to make this a success. But how can we shore up what is seen as a faltering multilateralism, because that is the whole purpose of G20, to have collective action of all the developed and the emerging economies, and it's a unique grouping. And as someone who's studying North-South relationships for a long time, this is a special group, where both North and South are represented. So going forward, Indian leadership and this mix and what it means for multilateralism.
Well, that's a lot of questions. First of all, thank you for having me here. I think first need to understand and put into perspective as to why is the G20 important. So of course we know the G20 is a group of, say, the G7 developed economies of the world, then the 12 the fast developing economies of the world, where of course which India is a part of, and also the European Union. And let me also just here point out this little difference, because I study Europe in great detail, is that if you look at G7, Europe is merely a participant, but if you look at the G20, Europe is a full member, and when we say the European Union, we are looking at the 28 members of the European Union. So that sort of, we understand that that is a huge grouping. Now, the bigger the grouping, the more the challenges also, Now, G20, very quickly, because G7 summit just happened, and I think a lot of times there is a confusion in understanding what are these groupings all about. There's a G7, earlier G7 was a G8, and now we have the G20 event coming up in India. Right now, of course, it's happening in Indonesia. I think next week it's kick-starting on the 15th and 16th of November in Bali in Indonesia, and thereon India takes on for the next 1 year. So very quickly, see, the thing is that one of the successes that G20 is credited with is that it is a rapid action force, because it came into existence after the 90s economic crises, and particularly after 2008, that big financial crisis. Its leaders have been meeting at the apex level every year. So that sort of, so G7 is perhaps more political and security oriented in nature, while G20 is more economic. It is more to do with the global economic and financial architecture. So that is not to say that it does not take into account the political problems of the countries, and international issues do not reflect. But in terms of the focus, I would say that G20 has a more economic and a financial.
The focus on crisis
management, exactly.
Yeah.
And if you've noticed that this particular year, in Indonesia, the slogan has been recover together and recover stronger. So obviously then there's something that we are recovering from, and it's just so to say, it's to be mentioned that the world was recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And until last year in 2021, a lot of things had started to look bright and better, but then came the war. So we have this twin challenge of the COVID-19, the unfinished project of recovery from COVID-19 pandemic, as well as this war in Ukraine with its all sorts of global
negative ramifications,
especially the economic and the food crisis.
Absolutely. So the G20 has its plate full, a lot of major challenges, and that's why when we are saying India's leadership is important, it is at a a moment of great crisis again in the world. We are facing recessionary trends in the global economy. Dr. Rao just mentioned the war that's been creating massive negative consequences around the world. So Indonesia is the chair, viewers. This year Indonesia is hosting the G20 and will be then passing on the baton to India. So I have a interesting video clip of Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the finance minister of Indonesia, talking about the challenges facing the G20 at present. Let's listen in.
We are witnessing an alarming increase in risk to food security as the impact of the war in Ukraine and sanctions, as well as export restriction, which are exacerbating the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic. This all has driven food prices to record level. We are likely to see these challenges to be global, to the global economy that will persist, and we need to address this issue. How to avoid the food price that keep even increasing. With the increasing food price, this could push millions more people into a state of food insecurity. Fuel shortages are unfolding around the world, and we are seeing this is have a huge political and social implication in Sri Lanka, Ghana, Peru, Ecuador, and elsewhere. These shortages due to the high gas prices is really an issue that is threatening our recovery. The world is in the middle of global energy crisis. The war, as well as commodity price increase, could worsen the global inflation spike and increase further social instability. We could see further deterioration in living standard, particularly for poor and vulnerable households. Low-income commodity importing countries are likely to be particularly affected, which could lead to further social and political unrest.
You was a very dire situation facing the world as laid out by the host of the G20 for 2022, Indonesia. And Dr. Rao, energy crisis, food crisis, inflation, and all these, they seem to have come at a time and really hammering the poor around the world. And Indonesia, India, and then it's going to be Brazil next. So the Troika is of the G20, as it's called, is all developing countries, and we are all going to be emphasizing the tremendous pressure that the developing world, the global south, is facing. And of course there are richer countries in the G20, as you mentioned, and they seem to have a somewhat different perspective because they are not they are also facing high energy prices, for example, but being wealthier, they can easily have buffers to manage these social crises. So the task for the Indonesians this year, and for India and for Brazil going forward, seems to be that recovery, but in a way that is fairer and in a way that keeps in mind that whatever policy decisions countries make. The whole idea of G20 is coordination, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
all of them together doing some common minimum things that will help lift us out of these crises. And on that front, self-centered behavior as well as a small group behavior that hurts the larger collective interests of humanity. That's
Right.
what we are seeing, and I think that's what the Indonesians are also worried about. In fact, Joko Widodo, the Indonesian president, even visited Russia and Ukraine a few months ago with the clear mandate to try and somehow bring this war to a halt,
Yeah.
and to remove the sanctions and all these things which are having these spiraling effects.
Right.
So G20, what can we do now,
Yes.
given these crises and all these intersecting sets of problems?
A very, very valid observation, Dr. Chaulia. And let me begin from where you left, where you said that the entire rationale of G20 makes sense only because it believes in coordinated action. I mean, that's why it has worked as a rapid action grouping. And coordination today calls for collective action. So somewhere it sort of takes into account that the G20 economies will come together. Now the problem is that if you don't tackle the fault lines, then how do you go about the collective action? The biggest fault line right now among the G20 is their respective positions on the Russian actions in Ukraine. So for example, India, we have constantly said that war is not in anybody's interest, and we have called for de-escalation, but we still refuse to join the Western sanction regime. Similarly, there's an OPEC plus divide when, to tackle the rising energy prices, the US administrations, particularly Biden, tried to really pressurize the Saudis and basically the OPEC plus countries to ramp up production so that the oil, it could ease pressure on the oil prices, but then they refused to do so because they said that that's against the core national interests. So you see, these are certain fault lines. But let me then tell you a little bit about what exactly are the fault lines for the G20s. These particular things that I just mentioned, these are perhaps problems that the entire world is facing, but also just in respect to the financial problems and the decisions that the G20 countries have earlier taken but are unable to implement. Those are also certain things that we need to look at. So for example, I think as you mentioned, and also the finance minister mentioned the food crisis. Now last year at the G20 summit which was held in Italy, there was something called a Matera Declaration, and the Matera Declaration particularly focuses on alleviating poverty and tackles food security. Now the question is, how do they do it? They do it by focusing on the PDBs, which is the public distribution banks, public distribution or public development banks, basically at a local level. Similarly, now that was something that India took up very enthusiastically. Our foreign affairs minister said that this is something which is very close to us because we are facing similar problems. Similarly, there's something called the Bridgetown Initiative, which focuses on the climate problems, how to bring about financing, how to bring about resilient financing. So these are things for which there are great plans that are existing, there are great initiatives that have been signed and welcomed, but the point is, how do you go about it? Because you see, the north-south divide is particularly true. Look at, for example, what is the G20 approach on the World Bank, the World Trade Organization appellate body. So because America said that they kind of froze the appointment of they froze the reappointment of judges. It is just lying vacant, and it has been on G20 agenda. It has still not found closure. Similarly, with respect to the COVID vaccine production, see, India, South Africa, Indonesia also, by the way, are group of those countries which are trying to lobby for the TRIPS waiver. And then the developed world like the EU, Germany, etc., they are against it. Okay, EU recently did give a partial waiver, but it is not enough to meet the requirements of the world.
And the G20 is supposed to give the guidance for resolving these imbalances between member states, but it's not happening as we desire. So that's another big challenge. Viewers, India's presidency, this is of course the center point of all attention, and I want you to listen to our Minister for Industry and Commerce, Piyush Goyal, announcing the presidency, the historic moment, and also what will be our key priorities. Listen in.
Friends, India is going to take on the G20 presidency on 1st December 2022 and will be the president and take the chairship of G20 for the year 2023. We will enter the Troika on 1st December 2021 and will play a leadership role on the issues and concerns of the developing countries and emerging market economies in the G20 forum under the leadership and guidance of Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi. Our efforts in building more consensus and building back the support of all the developed nations towards resilient supply chains and faster recovery of vulnerable economies of low-income and developing countries has been widely appreciated by other G20 members, and we shall continue to represent the voice of the low and middle income countries. Thank you.
So viewers, India's Ministry of Industry and Commerce, he was also Sherpa, India's Sherpa for the G20, Piyush Goyal, talking about the task ahead, which is to bring about cohesion within the G20. Already Dr. Rao, we were talking about the G7 and then the other emerging economies and the discord among them on various issues. India, we have said, is infusing greater positivity and optimism in G20 deliberations. We are trying to be a bridge builder. So on one hand, we are of course part of the global south and we are the voice of that. A lot of the guest countries that we are inviting for the summit, every host country can invite non-members as guests. Bangladesh, Egypt, Mauritius and so on do represent a broader global south. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that the G7, the Western countries and Japan also come along. So we are going to be using, it will take a lot of diplomacy and a lot of skill to find commonalities, and to make sure that for example, on this interest rate policies, for example, to tackle inflation, each is going its own way. And this is just as it had happened during the 2008 economic crisis. Just to give one example. So there are a lot of such issues where India will be really put to the test, and we are preparing for it. So how are we going to be this bridge builder, and how do you think India is unique as opposed to a country which is, let's say, we have a strong anti-colonial legacy, but at the same time we don't want to antagonize other parties that may lead to total breakdown, or not even know what if there is not even a declaration. I mean, that's a real fear going forward. A lot of the G20 ministerials and the preparatory meetings so far for the Bali summit, there has not even been a joint declaration, and there's a real fear that bickering will get worse. So how do you think we're going to be able to hold the ship together?
Actually, Dr. Chaulia, I think the best way to look at it, about India's unique position is that India is a country that has kind of championed keeping its national interest first, and sort of understanding that the world is aligned in different poles, and that we need to engage, and we need to simultaneously engage. And particularly, from the Ukrainian war, this particular pitch in India's diplomatic pragmatism has been sort of, come out really well. That's one. The second thing is that, yes, of course, G20 is definitely, now we can go on talking about the shortcomings of G20, why it's not been very effective, why there are no enforcement mechanisms, etc. We can go about that. But at the same time, there is no denying the fact that G20 is a platform where all these diverse, leaders meet, they talk, then there are so many meetings that are happening on the sidelines, etc. So the importance cannot be sort of overstated, right? We started with that. In terms of what India should be doing, you see, I already mentioned the entire program about food, so to say, security and poverty alleviation. I think the second thing that India is going to look at is, for example, all this role of the multilateral development banks and the agenda on SDR, the special drawing rights. Because let me just tell you something, just as the G20 is happening now, I think a month ago, the World Bank and the IMF annual meetings happened. And then just as the G20 will happen, simultaneously, there's another very important global multilateral meeting which is going to take place in Egypt, which is COP27. So what I'm saying is that all these agendas are linked. They will not make sense without the North-South dialogue. India is seen as a player. When India talks, the world listens. We saw it in different ways. India was invited to the G7. India was invited to all these important, India is also chairing the SCO. Okay, and the Shanghai Cooperation, India is now chairing the G20. But the more important thing is that we have to make sure that the SDR, so to say, because the IMF gives, there's a quota for every country, and if you look at the numbers, it's basically the developed world which is getting the like an so to say justifiable amount of disproportionate share of the SDR versus the developing countries or the low income countries, which are only about at 1%. Similarly for COVID vaccines, if you look at the developed world, because India is definitely the Vishwa Guru when it comes to vaccine diplomacy. And India should take that up because it is a G20 agenda, which is that, about more than 60% of the developed world is already vaccinated. But, about 90% of the undeveloped and the Africa, developing countries are still not vaccinated. So that cannot happen without the TRIPS waiver, for example, on vaccines. So those are kind of things that we need to sort of, remain joint at.
And ultimately, it's a vision, isn't it, Dr. Rao, that, we are all in it together. And that kind of vision, in times of economic crisis and geopolitical polarization, it kind of vanishes because everyone is unable to see the big picture. And the G20 ultimately has to bring that back, right? That notion that your fate is interconnected to mine, in the sense, if you resort to self-interested policies that harm the others, then it will ultimately come back to haunt you. Right? I mean, that's the whole idea.
Yeah, that's right. And also, if you notice, the G20, for example, it does not also reflect a lot of the developing world. For example, I mean, where is Singapore? There is Indonesia. Indonesia is so critical. I mean, ASEAN countries are so critical for any framework in Indo-Pacific to work. But if you look at the G20, it's probably only Indonesia. Where are the other ASEAN countries? It's not reflected. Similarly, if you look at Europe, for example, there is no Norway. Norway has been trying to make a point about it that we are a developed country, we are a developed economy. But since we are not part of the European Union, we kind of miss out on the chance. Similarly, Switzerland. So, and so the thing is that we need to sort of work towards that to make it more inclusive by different ways. I think maybe the number suffers there, but there can be different ways maybe in making it more inclusive.
And last point, Dr. Rao, there is also this what we call multi-stakeholder multilateralism. The engagement groups of the G20.
Yes.
We have the Business 20, the Youth 20, the labor unions 20, the think tanks 20, your institution, the IDSA, is part of the T20, mechanism. So these are important, because otherwise there is no faith of the international community, right? It looks like a big jamboree and speeches are being given, and then it doesn't trickle down to affect the lives of ordinary people around the planet. So the outreach groups, the engagement that we are doing, Indian presidency, we are going to emphasize, we are going to do more than 200 consultations across the G20 member states and even beyond the non-members. So that, I think, ultimately is necessary, because the credibility of G20 is at stake. Is not just the results or the outcomes, it's also about the representation and the legitimacy.
The very process, you see, when you look at G20, so one of the things in which I look at it is also the process itself has to be legitimate enough, and it has to be inclusive. So one of the ways in which we are looking at, I mean, in India, is that we are going to be having this entire year with all these, think tanks and the civil society and the different other stakeholders. So the larger idea is to basically go for a G2G, a B2B, a P2P, and also the different permutations and combinations possible, so that there is a collective voice. Because when there's a collective voice, there'll be a collective awareness. And when there is an awareness, at least there'll be the political will and the international will to tackle the problems. Because of course, the problems that we are, in today, these are not going to be solved by one country alone or one government alone.
Exactly, and that is of course the logic of global governance, that there are problems without passports across borders, but then unless we come together and have a team effort and make sacrifices in the larger global interest, that's also very important. The diplomacy, negotiations, all at G20 is all about give and take. So these are fundamental to the progress of the G20. And viewers, I hope you understood the complications of this institution that Dr. Rao and I have discussed, but also think about the potential. Imagine a world without G20. Already the UN system has not been reformed, and emerging powers are not getting their due in the UN system. If there was not even a G20, there would be total anarchy, or what Ian Bremmer, one of the well-known American thinkers, calls a G0 world, as in there's no leadership at all. But we want leadership, we want collective leadership, and India's leadership is important. So Indian presidency and the handover from Indonesia is a very crucial process. So keep following these and think about the larger good, public good, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is the core of Indian ethos and philosophy. I want to thank Dr. Swasti Rao for sharing valuable insights.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So, until next time, I'll see you again, but do think about the G20 and this signature moment of a great global crisis where India is rising to the challenge to try and find some order and find some stability. Take care.